Now we have from 5G Americas, Chief of the Federal Communications Commission Office and Engineering Technology, Julius Kanpp. Please.
Good morning. So I think I'm the first speaker after what your program says, coffee break. So I have to be quick. There's more detail on these slides, which you can look at later on. I'm just going to hit some high points. I know that 5G has to be a compelling and interesting subject. And the reason I know that is this morning I was having breakfast downstairs, and people were preparing for tours of Brazil to see all the wonderful sights. I was tempted to join them, but I came here anyway. So I'm going to tell you just a little bit about regulation in the United States. And I'm going to zip through it just to make the main point that all parts of government in the US are pulling together to enable 5G. So I'm from the Federal Communications Commission. We're an independent regulatory agency, and we're headed by a chairman, Ajit Pai, and commissioners. We've got about 1,450 people. It's a mix of engineers, attorneys, and economists. But what's a little different about spectrum management in the United States is it's a divided responsibility between the FCC and the executive branch. And about, some estimate as high as 80% of the spectrum is shared with other federal agencies. And so we have mechanisms in place to coordinate all of this. The term that you also will hear is the National Telecommunications and Information Administration. They work with organizations like the Department of Defense, the Food and Drug Administration, and so forth, all pulling together to manage the spectrum. So at the FCC, our chairman, Ajit Pai, has published what he's called the 5G FAST plan. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about the elements of this. It's a little bit different than some of the things that you heard earlier today. Whoop, a little too quick. So spectrum. In the US, a popular sport is football. It's a little different than the football, what you call football around most of the rest of the world. And it's often described when you go in to make a football play by a set of numbers, 14, 32, 76. Sometimes when I look at all of the spectrum bands in play, it sounds more like a football play. There are so many bands in play. And I'm not going to go through them all. There's another panel later on today. We'll talk more about that. But the important thing is that none of these are described as 5G bands. You have flexibility in the United States to deploy whatever technology you like in any of the bands. And what's important is not a single band, but a strategy that includes low, high, and mid spectrum. And the reason for that is the lower bands are great for coverage, the mid bands are a sweet spot for capacity and coverage, and the high bands, enormous capacity. And what we've been trying to do is provide spectrum in each one of those buckets. There we go. So what you really haven't heard a lot about today so far is infrastructure. In order for 5G to be deployed, it's going to take many more cells. And that means deployment far more extensively than in the past. And there have been some barriers to that, including things like attachment on poles and the process for getting approval by local authorities for deployment. So what we've been working on at the Commission is to streamline that process for attachment of poles, putting in place things like a clock for the local governments to approve the infrastructure deployment. So key piece, infrastructure. And then it's all of these other regulations that we don't talk about that really affect investment. Things like what is the provisions that are in place for transitioning from older technologies to new ones. I think we focus so much on 5G, we can't lose sight of the fact that the older generation technologies, and I hesitate to even call them older because we're still seeing advances in LTE. LTE is going to be here for a long time. There are still second generation systems that are out there. So what are the policies in place about how those pieces fit together, how the network architecture is governed? So on the FCC front, we've been doing a lot on the regulatory side to remove those barriers. Now, Congress is also involved. The Congress earlier this year had adopted what some might call a Spectrum Act. It had a number of provisions for the FCC or the NTIA that I spoke about earlier to develop reports or take actions looking at specific frequency bands, to promote unlicensed, which is also a key piece of this. I've listed a number of the bullets there. But the important point out of this is at the congressional level, they too are pushing to make sure that we've encouraged investment and development in 5G. We've had in the past a couple of memos from presidents on spectrum, but I can't recall an event from the White House that focused specifically on the rollout of a technology. And that happened, I guess it was about a month ago. The White House held a 5G summit. It included presentations by prominent members of the administration, key figures in industry and across government, the carriers as well, all pulling together. I've given you the link there. If you have time, you might be interested in taking a look at it. It's about 45 minutes long. And the president has also issued a memo on spectrum, and it talks about developing a national spectrum strategy, and there's timelines for that and a number of other actions. So out of all this, main point I wanted to get across was that at all levels of government, we're pulling together to create a fertile ground for 5G, and not just spectrum, but the other things I talked about in terms of the deployment of the infrastructure and eliminating unnecessary regulations. The sign says finished. I'm finished. Thank you.